The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining today's webinar session, Immigration, Quarantine and Overseas Business Travel. Look, just before we get going, so some housekeeping rules on the session today. So the lines are mute because there's quite a few of us on the session. So if you've got any questions for today's speakers, I'll introduce them shortly. If you've got any questions, please do fire them through the question box. You can see in the corner of your screen now. I can see we've got a couple come through already, which is great. I know we've got some time allotted at the end for questions. The lines are being so that the session will be recorded, and a copy of that recording will be made available afterwards to everyone that registered for this session. I'm delighted to say today's speakers. I'm joined by two familiar faces or voices, Tim Thomas, who's Director of Labour Market and Skills, and Alice Tranter, Labour Market and Skills Policy Advisor. Both work within Make UK within the Employment and Skills Directorate there, and they'll be taking you through today's presentation. So look, without further ado, I'll hand you over to Tim to take you through the first part of today's presentation.
Thanks, Roger. Welcome to everyone on this particular session. So we're going to cover a wide range of issues today. We're going to cover the latest travel restrictions that have been announced by government, quarantine, we're calling those, an outline of what they are, how government has come to this decision, how long they're going to last for at a minimum, and some exemptions that we know from speaking to Make UK members and manufacturers in general that they're very interested in. Then I'm going to hand over to Alice, and Alice will cover items 2 and 3. That's the Immigration and Social Security Bill that's currently going through Parliament, and also the Migration Advisory Committee, or the MAC, consultation on the Shortage Occupation List, or the SOL, that again is extremely important to the UK's future immigration system. So some chunky topics there to get our teeth into. As Roger said, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat box. We're going to take all the questions at the end, so we will save everything up and at the end go through everything that we have had through during the course of the webinar. So without further ado, let's look at these latest travel restrictions and what they mean for manufacturers and how government is enforcing these. So travel restrictions for UK visitors. I'm going to come back to the title in a minute because the slide's entitled UK visitors, but there could be a significant gloss on that, as we'll discover in a moment. These restrictions are imposed by regulation, not guidance, and so have the force of law. So if you've been following the UK webinars, you will know that we have covered recently, for example, the safer working practices guidance that came out from government and how manufacturers can tailor their sites and their production facilities to make sure that they comply with that guidance. Now, the key difference is that with guidance, this isn't. These are regulations. This is hard law the government has enacted and brought into force to impose these travel restrictions. And the regulations cover all international travellers arriving in England. Let's pause there. The title of the slide says UK visitors. So note these restrictions and regulations cover international travellers coming into England. And they basically say that these arrivals are required to self-isolate for 14 days in the interest of public health. And the reasoning behind the regulations and logic behind the regulations is that they are intended to prevent the spread of the virus, COVID-19, in the UK as we reach a point where clearly infections are falling. And there is certain international evidence that after other countries have actually found a way of containing the virus and reducing the infection rate, that then people visiting the country are the main risk for a rise in infections. So that's why government has taken this action. But public health is a devolved matter. So if you tune into any Make UK webinars and keep an eye on our website, you'll note that we have a webinar coming up with Public Health England in a couple of days' time to take your questions. And that is clearly Public Health England. That only applies to England and not to Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland. So public health is a matter that's devolved between the 4 home nations, Wales, Scotland, England and Northern Ireland. So enforcement measures and these regulations will therefore be set and dealt with by the devolved administrations. It's fair to say that the Westminster government is hoping that the devolved administrations mirror what they're doing and follow suit. So from the 8th of June, 2 days ago, all arrivals from outside the common travel area are required to complete an online locator form. So pause on that bullet and explain what the common travel area is. So again, if you've been following Make UK webinars, if you've been following the webinars that we laid on to do with Brexit and the European Union, you will have picked up that the common travel area is an area designated between the United Kingdom, the 4 home nations I've described, and also the Republic of Ireland. And within that common travel area, broadly, it's an area of free movement. So you can move from the Republic of Ireland to Northern Ireland or any other of the 4 home nations with an absolute minimum of control. And essentially, for most immigration purposes, Irish nationals are treated the same as UK nationals. So these regulations only apply to arrivals from outside that common travel area. As you see, there's an online locator form, which you'll see a screenshot of in a moment on. Now, this form will require the traveller to provide contact details and travel details, and notably an address for self-isolation. So the idea behind these particular restrictions is that the arrivee in the UK provides those details, provides an address, and that therefore there is a way of checking up to make sure that they're at a particular location, self-isolating for those 2 weeks after they arrive in the United Kingdom, or more particularly England, and these particular regulations. So, second slide on these travel restrictions for UK visitors. So when travellers can't self-isolate in their own accommodation, the guidance says that the government will assist them in finding accommodation at their own expense. I don't think that's in the regulations, that's just something the government has said that they will do. Those arriving in England from, I'll explain the mnemonics in a minute, who entered these places from overseas within 14 days of travel are also required to self-isolate. So CTA Common Travel Area, IOM Isle of Man, CH Channel Islands. So if you arrive in England from any of those locations and you travelled within 14 days and went back to, for example, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands, and then came to England within, say, 7 days, then you again are required to self-isolate on the basis that you've been outside England and outside the Channel Islands or the Isle of Man, the Common Travel Area recently, and therefore there's a potential risk of infection in you coming to England. If you've been in, for example, the Common Travel Area for 14 days after you travelled outside, then you don't need to self-isolate when you come into England. There is a review, and all these measures will be reviewed on the 29th of June, and that broadly is in keeping with lots of other government restrictions in relation to COVID-19. You will see the regular press conferences on television and the regular review dates. So these measures, these restrictions, these regulations will be reviewed to see if they are still required or whether greater restrictions are required in light of the infection rate of COVID-19. Now, I've mentioned several times that these restrictions are backed by regulation, they're not guidance, and therefore there are penalties for failing to comply. Fixed penalty, first offence for to apply £1,000, that doubles and it goes up on a ready reckoner basis, and essentially it reaches a cap of £3,200 for a failure to comply. I mentioned that there's a notice to complete on arrival. If you haven't completed the notice, there's a fixed penalty of £100. What we don't know yet is how stringently these fines and penalties are going to be enforced. I believe it's the case that all those required to self-isolate providing an address, not everyone is going to be checked, that there will be a random sample of people that will be checked, and then it's not every single arrival that's going to be subject to a check by an authority. Similarly, the failure to complete the arrival notice, we're not sure yet how vociferously that is going to be enforced at passport control. We believe it's going to be the border force that will have primary responsibility for ensuring that these regulations are complied with. So, travel restrictions for visitors, third slide on that, screenshot you'll see there. There's the address at the top where you can find details on measures and exemptions, and that is what you will see if you're looking for information on the online locator form. I think you can navigate it to from that page that you need to complete before arriving in the United Kingdom. So much for the restrictions themselves. Broadly, you arrive in the UK and you need to self-isolate 14 days at an address that is given to the authorities and complete the online locator form before you arrive. So that broadly is the architecture within which we are working. So lots of questions then from members of Make UK. who are looking to make sure that they can get back to some production that's more like normal post-COVID-19, ramp up production, bring workers back to work. And then they're thinking that actually they need to bring some people into the UK from outside who have specialist technical skills to assist them either with plant and machinery, commissioning, maintenance, repair, those sorts of functions. And some members, inquiries from, have actually bought plant and equipment, and that now needs to be installed, and they're looking to bring the installation technicians and engineers into the UK from overseas so they can take advantage of that equipment that they were expecting some time ago. So what exemptions are there? Well, within the regulations and the guidance, a combination of the two from government, there are a list of several exemptions that may be of use to manufacturers. What I've done on the next couple of slides is not list every single one. Some of them don't have any application to manufacturing and engineering. Some of them refer to government personnel, for example. However, what we can do is make sure that you're provided with a list of all the exemptions if you think there's something that is outside what you're about to see that might benefit you. Now, the reason I've started with this particular slide and this particular exemption is it is the one that has the one that has the greatest remit within the list of exemptions apply. So many of the exemptions are quite narrowly defined, and as you see, that one on the screen there even refers to emergency works. But if you read the wording of this particular exemption, it's workers with specialist technical skills coming to UK for essential emergency works or services, and that includes commissioning, maintenance, repair and safety checks to ensure continued production, the supply, movement, manufacture, storage or preservation of goods. Let's just unpick it a little bit. These are specialist technical skills, so it's essential or emergency work or services, and they are to be read disjunctively. In other words, they are each separate categories of exemption. The including is just examples of, as opposed to being a definitive list. And the services or works or essential or emergency works are to ensure continued production, supply, movement, etc. Now, when in that sentence you see the word continued production, that does not necessarily mean that you can only use this exemption if you are looking to bring people into the UK to work on an existing production process or existing machinery. But this also includes, as you say, commissioning. So this, we believe, would also include the situation where a manufacturer has bought plant and equipment, is bringing that into the UK, and then, as I've given the example, wants to bring in the specialist technicians to site, maintain, commission it, etc. So when we've gone back to government to ask about the minutiae of this exemption, and whether we take the words literally, or whether we take the words and we interpret them as a flexible exemption, the answer we got from government is actually they're looking at a flexible interpretation of this particular exemption. So it's not simply continued production, it is to ensure production and that you can continue to produce whatever it was you are intending to manufacture, even if that is potentially installing new equipment, for example. So that is a very helpful exemption for manufacturers. You'll still need to complete the public health passenger online locator form that I referred to. You don't need to self-isolate for 14 days, but there is a little bit of red tape to comply with. So the arrivee, the visitor to the UK, will need to have a letter from the company that includes the information you see on the screen: personal data, name and address, contact details for the employer, details of the business or org that you'll be completing the work for, and what work you'll be doing. Photo identification, if you have it. I need to show that your travel to the UK is essential for work here. So essentially, another letter, or the same letter, from your employer, consignment, delivery note, operator's license, for example. So something to flesh out why you're using that particular exemption and why it's essential work for the business in question. So 2 bits of red tape there. Make sure you fill out the locator form, and also make sure that you have the letter covering the details that you see on the screen, and then you won't have to self-isolate for 14 days. So that's the first exemption to bring to your attention. I'm now going to go on to look at a few other exemptions that might be relevant to manufacturers. But on speaking to our members and on taking inquiries so far, that first exemption there probably is the most flexible one that you're going to come across. So next set of exemptions, and we have had some questions from manufacturers before today, on certainly the first two. People who live in the UK but working in another country, essentially these are frontier workers. And if you pop down a few bullets and look at the highlighted one, people live outside the UK but work in the UK. So those essentially mirror opposites of each other. They're both frontier workers, and you either work in the UK but live somewhere else, or live in the UK and work somewhere else. But those two categories of frequent mobile workers are not required to self-isolate. Requirement that they work at least once a week, either in the UK or somewhere else. I suppose the most likely example is going to be someone that works in the European Union as a member state that's quite close to the UK and might be travelling on a weekly basis. So a little bit of red tape, again, you'll see for both. Again, they need to complete the passenger locator form before they travel, and they need to show evidence that you reside in one country but work in another. So the example given there on the screen is, for example, a season ticket. Could be something else, that's just an example. So it could be a confirmatory letter from an employer, for example, of something of that nature. But those two categories of people then clearly would not be required to self-isolate. The reasoning being that travelling so frequently it would be impossible to do their job if they were required to isolate. I'm going to pop down that slide now to towards the bottom, the third bullet from the end, and the highlighted bullet, drivers of goods vehicles or public service vehicles or other employees or community licence holders, international carriage of goods passengers by coach or bus. So again, essentially that's delivery drivers. So again, another useful exemption for Make UK members. We know a lot of supply chains rely on product that comes into the UK via the road network, either it's manufactured further afield or manufactured in the European Union. So those particular drivers are not required to self-isolate for 14 days. A very useful exemption there if you're looking to ramp up production and making sure that you can get your inventory from the European Union or further afield. So the other exemptions, within everything you see on the screen there, behind it is a little bit more detail in every case. I've just highlighted some ones that I think from speaking to Make UK members in the past might be relevant to some of the types of manufacturing and production that we know our members engage in. So for example, water and sewage sectors, people coming in, again, technical skills, they're not required to self-isolate for 14 days. If you want to know more, let us know and provide some details. Essential or emergency works on the rail network. We know, for example, that many of our members are involved in rail signalling or the rail network system. Workers with specialist skills, management, sorting, treatment, recovery, disposal of waste. So again, we know that many of our members supply products, supply capital, equipment, and machinery to the waste sector, to people that recycle, for example. I'll move on to the next one. Workers with specialist skills in generation, transmission, distribution of electricity and gas, including offshore oil and gas. So we know that the electricity sector, the oil and utility sector, is one that many of our members work in and also supply vital equipment into. So again, if you're bringing in workers with necessary specialist skills into the UK and you work in oil, gas, electricity, transmission, generation, again, you would have a potential exemption there to rely on. And the last one, again, very important to many Make UK members, specialist aerospace engineers or specialist workers responsible for safe operation of aircraft. So again, if you're in the aero defence sector and you need to bring people into the UK, again, there is a exemption for you there. That's just a short whistle stop throughout the exemptions. The first exemption is the one that I think most of our members are more likely to rely on, and that's where we provide a little bit more information on the process behind that. But what you see on the screen now, I think will be relevant to many more manufacturers. And if you think you're in one of those sectors and want to know more, please pop something in the chat box or contact us at the end via our email addresses, and we can supply you with some more information. So those are a quick whistle stop tour through the quarantine regulations, through the exemptions, and I'm going to pause at that point, and I'm going to hand over the rest of the presentation to Alice, who will take you through the Immigration and Social Security Bill, and also the consultation from the Migration Advisory Committee. At that point, am I safe to hand over, Roger?
You are, Alice. You should be able to pick up the presentation from here. Tim, I know you're sticking around after for some questions, and just to say there are some questions coming through, so that'll be really useful. And just check, Alice, I think you're off mute, so you should be able to take the slide deck from here.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Tim. As Tim just said, I'm just going to talk you through the National Security Bill, which had its second reading recently. And Tim actually gave evidence yesterday at the Public Bill Committee on what it means for the manufacturing sector and our members. So a bit of background, this has come around because the Conservatives came to government end of last year, and their manifesto pledged to end freedom of movement following the Brexit vote and introduce a new immigration system, which has now become known as a points-based system. This means that entrants to the UK, whether you're EU or non-EU, will have to gain points in order to come in, and that will be based on your skill, your qualification, job offer, of which I'll go into more detail later on. This is coming into force 1st of January 2021 next year. So we've got until the end of December to have freedom of movement, and then that ends. We do like to stress this is not turning off the tap completely. The Home Office has been quite keen to stress that this is a very phased-in approach, and there's a lot of detail on the first phase of changes on the Home Office website, which includes information around the various routes, of which I'll go into. All the routes require points, hence the points-based system. Some are more strict than the others. Routes that we're familiar with, such as Tier 1 and Tier 2, remain, but they've been rebranded and renamed and changed around a bit. The health surcharge has been doubled, which will have a bit of an impact on employers, although as we've seen recently in the news, NHS workers will now be exempt from the health surcharge. There are new salary and skill thresholds, which I'll go into a bit. These have been reduced significantly, which is a policy win for Make UK. So quite a few changes coming in next year, but it's good that we get prepared now. And further, there is a call for evidence surrounding this, which I will talk about later on as well. So a bit of an overview from Make UK. Currently, 95% of our members do not hire a non-EU worker, so they're not familiar with the hiring process of someone outside of the EU, and frankly, freedom of movement enables them to hire with ease. Therefore, only 5% are familiar with the process of recruiting a non-EU national. So come January next year, all our members will now have to adapt to this new system. This is because non-EU citizens and EU citizens will all be subject to the same system. There's no buckets for different people. They're all going to have the same criteria and route in. As I mentioned, there's a new salary threshold for all, which I'll go into, which has been reduced. And the 5 routes that I mentioned before, again, are Tier 1, which has now been called Exceptional Talent Route. The Skilled Worker Route, which is the main route, used to be known as Tier 2. We've got the new entrance route. Students will now be subject to the points-based system, which is a change, so they'll have to gain their own points. Similar to before, they'll have to prove they can speak sufficient English and prove that they are financially independent for the time they are here. And then there's a very sort of the goodies bucket called the bespoke visa route, whereas you can see NHS workers, entrepreneurs, or those who have graduated in a STEM subject, so science, engineering, all of that, have a fast track visa, and they bypass a lot of the immigration system criteria because they are considered vital to levelling up the country and filling occupations that we desperately need. So that's a bit of the overview from our point of view. The skilled workers route, which will be the one that the majority of businesses and members use, requires the points that I just said. So all routes need 70 points, that is the magic number, to come and work and live in the UK. So that means all applicants, EU and non-EU, will need a job offer from an approved sponsor. for this route only, tier 2, that earns you 20 points. This means a lot of businesses in the UK will now need to go and get a sponsorship license, which is a bit administrative, but easily done. The next 20 points you can earn is the job offer is at the required skill level. So we need to do some mapping there. That's another 20 points. And then if you can speak English, which will have to be met by a test, that's another 10 points. And then the fourth one is obviously the salary threshold. So this has been lowered from £30,000 to 25,600, and that's another 20 points. Now, these 4 points or criteria are mandatory. They're not tradable. You can't swap them. You have to tick off all 4 of these to get so far. But as you can see, you will be thinking not all skilled workers will earn 25,600. It's still a bit of a difficulty. So, as I said here, if the migrant meets requirements 1 to 3, which means they've got a job offer, the job offer is at the required skill level, and they can speak good English, but they earn less than 25,600, there are 2 alternatives to try and get past that, if you like. I'm going to be talking about the shortage occupation list in a minute, but what it is, it's a list compiled of occupations that are in shortage in this country, and it's under review right now. And if the job role that you're recruiting for is on this list, you do not have to be earning 25,600, but a new minimum base rate, which is 20,480, and that gets you 20 points. That takes you up to 70 to come in. If the job role is not on this list, but they have a PhD relevant for the job or a PhD in a STEM subject, that is also an alternative route to get in. There's been many questions as to what a lower skilled route would be. Unfortunately, there isn't one, which is why there's such an importance on this shortage occupation list, which I'll go into. But this is the main route that we know about. It's the most detailed route. It's got all the points published and all the rules surrounding it. No, so the actual bill is actually quite simple. There's not much in it. It's been passed through Parliament to, frankly, end freedom of movement between the UK and EU. As I said, it's currently before UK Parliament. It's going to apply nationwide to all the job role nations, UK as well. And it's going to retain the common travel area, which I think Tim referred to earlier in the webinar, with the Republic of Ireland. And it retains the current EU law relating to social security provisions, which is important. So when you do go to the EU or come to the UK, your social security will be protected in the form of an A1 form to prove that you which social security you can pay. Now, to take you on to the Migration Advisory Committee's call for evidence on the shortage occupation list, which I referred to earlier. The MAC, as we call them, are an organisation that frankly advises the government on all matters to do with immigration. They had previously drawn up a previous SOL. They have advised on the points-based system themselves. They released a report on it and are heavily involved with influencing them. And they are currently calling for evidence on which job roles should be put on this shortage occupation list, and asking organisations such as Make UK to put forward a robust argument as to why we should have these occupations on the list in order to recruit non-UK citizens at a lower salary than 25,600. So the background, this is following the UK's decision to leave the EU on the 27th of June 2016, and the subsequent legislation found in the UK's EU withdrawal agreement, which we all saw. Freedom of movement, as I said, will end after the transition period on the 31st of December 2020, and the current government have committed to honouring the date. The Home Office has been quite keen to tell us they will not be asking for an extension to the transition period. Therefore, they are very adamant that the new immigration system will be coming into force January 2021. And as I said, the immigration bill is still before Parliament. So everything is supposed to be on track. And this call for evidence has got quite a time window as well. because we're asking the Home Office to publish as much detail as possible before the changes so employers can be. So the new system and the threshold, so as I sort of previously explained before, is going to be known as a points-based system when migrants wishing to work in the UK will need to accrue the minimum amount of points, which is 70, as I said, and this is for all routes. And to really hone on the biggest problem here, it's the new salary threshold. This has been reduced, which is a good thing. We've lobbied for this from 30,000 a year to 25,600. And this new threshold will ensure that the majority of the EU citizens that do come to work in the UK are placed in low-paid jobs, also referred to as low-skilled jobs, which is a different name the Home Office gives to those who are lower paid. This means there is no low-skilled route to the UK come January 2021, which was the government's intention. So the short occupation list, which I briefly referred to, this is reviewed by the Home Office under the recommendation of the Migration Advisory Committee, as I said, the MAC, and they've done one before. So we have an existing list that it's either going to be expanded or changed up a bit this year, presumably after COVID. It's affected the labour market as such. So this is the list that compiles the occupations in the UK that are frankly quite hard to fill, and therefore employers look abroad for alternative employees. This is presumably because the UK has a skills gap. We don't have the required digital skills, for example, or the technical skills that our businesses need, but are found elsewhere within the EU. So in March this year, the government commissioned the MAC to compile a new UK survey, which will primarily focus on occupations at RQF levels 3 to 5, which is referred to as medium skilled. Now, RQF level 3 means A level, that's the level it is, and level 5 would be equivalent to a foundation degree at university. So that's what the skill levels are looking for to be put on this list. And as I said, it's quite a tight call for evidence, and they're going to report in September this year on what that new list will be. So we're working towards that. So this is the most important part of the new system. Essentially, if an employer wishes to recruit a non-UK migrant, but that job role earns below the 25,600 threshold, they have the option to earn the 20 points needed if the occupation is on the SOL, as I explained. And effectively, a place on this list bypasses the need that salary threshold and allows quite literally the vital low-paid workers that we need to continue to work and live in the UK. And I'm sort of doing a bit of a request here. If your company or business has occupations that do earn less than this salary, are typically hard to fill from UK recruitment, please do let me know and we can have a discussion about that. I've been having lots of discussions with the MAC themselves. They really want a good argument as to why these specific occupations are hard to fill by UK nationals, why you must go to the EU to recruit, and why is that skill level paid less than 25,000? But it's quite a good argument to make, as we'd say, the skills we require in some areas just aren't found in this country yet. And we do have to look to the EU. So this is a really, really good consultation that we want to take part in and put forward as much information as possible so we can get those lower paid workers onto that list so we can continue to recruit from the EU where we need to. I've put my email address at the bottom if you wish to discuss with me any job roles you can think of within your company or business that you'd like to see on the SOL because you believe you rely on EU nationals for those roles. I'm going to pass on to Roger now, who will take you through further support we have on our website. And thank you very much for listening.
Excellent. Thanks. Thanks for that, Alice. As Alice mentioned, there's a link on the screen right now, and I've also posted that in the chat box, which you can see in the corner of your screens. So there's a HRL quarantine checklist, which is part of the Back to Business support pack that's available for members via the link that's in the chat box there. And there's also, I'd urge you to read the blog as well from Make UK's employment law team that looks at the complications of managing employees impacted by quarantine. Tackles lots of the thorny issues that I can see that are sort of coming up in the questions that are coming through to Tim and Alice today. So definitely worth a read there. Look, thanks, Alice. Thanks, Tim. I have got some questions for you both if you're still around and can come off mute. That would
we're
be
here.
useful. Good, excellent. Thank you both. Okay, so I'm just going to fire through these for as much time as we've got left. But Tim, maybe one for you, I guess here. But someone sending a UK technician to the EU for work. When he or she returns, do they have to quarantine?
Yeah, so strange you should mention this, Roger. We're having some, we're raising issues with government at the moment on this very situation. And that's exactly what we're talking about. So you send someone from the UK, for whatever reason, to the European Union or wider afield. They then come back to the UK. What is the position? The exemptions that I ran through apply to workers coming into the UK undertaking one of the roles that I've just covered. So the fact that you went to the EU to carry out emergency work doesn't avail you of the need to quarantine when you come back into the UK. So all those exemptions apply to all visitors into the UK, even if you left the UK to go and work somewhere else. So on the face of it, yes, Roger, when you come back into the UK, you're going to need to quarantine, self-isolate for those 14 days, unless when you come back in, you can again fit yourself within one of the exemptions. So if, for example, you've gone to, for the sake of argument, Germany for your employer, and under the German regulations, you are permitted to do that, for the sake of argument, and you've complied with whatever the domestic rules are. When you come back into the UK, you're either going to self-isolate or you're going to need to fit within one of those exemptions that I referred to. So, for example, if that person was coming back into the UK and was then going to work on the commissioning or repair or installation of a piece of equipment, and they complied with the online locator form and had the necessary documents with them that I refer to, then they would not be required to self-isolate. If they've come back into the UK and they are not going to slot within one of these exemptions that I've just referred to, then they will need to isolate for 14 days. Bit of a long-winded answer, Roger, but hopefully I've covered it.
No, thanks for that. And just related to that, you mentioned self-isolation. There's a few questions as well around payment during that self-isolation period.
Yes.
Where do we stand there, Tim?
Another good question. So in keeping with everything from Make UK, if you look at our website and you go to the coronavirus part of it, you will find a list of frequently asked questions. Under the managing employees during the pandemic FAQ, perhaps we can put the link, Roger, in the chat at some point. You will find a frequently asked question, which is 2A, and 2A under that section has a lot of information on this, and I can update you on it now. So in terms of payment, the position is this. There is the ability for people who are self-isolating to receive statutory sick pay, and the government has these two set of regulations on SSP. I've seen some online chat, and it's no more than that, but it's from a source that is usually very well informed and a reputable source, indicating that SSP is not going to be payable for those people that come into the UK and have to self-isolate under quarantine. The reasoning that I've seen is that the SSP regulations were changed for people that are self-isolating in accordance with, for example, NHS government guidance on self-isolation. This is not NHS guidance, this is regulation on quarantine. So whilst that might seem a technical difference, from the online chat I saw, that was the difference that HMRC was saying in the regulations that made it the case that SSP would not be payable. So if SSP is not payable, what therefore are an employer's options in the case of someone that's coming in and needs to self-isolate for reasons of quarantine? Well, we in our FAQs give members and employees a number of options to think about. This is only options and it's for the employer to decide. But you may want to take a view on company sick pay policy. I mean, technically, this is not sickness because someone may not be sick or even displaying symptoms, but sick pay policy could be something that you could activate in such circumstances when someone's at home for 14 days. The other options that we look to in our FAQ is perhaps taking holiday, taking leave, or allowing employees to take unpaid quarantine leave to cover the quarantine period. But clearly, this is a situation that employers are going to need to deal with delicately. If you've got an employee that's come back into the UK and they've been sent out of the UK for work reasons, you may take a different view of how you're going to remunerate them. But those are the options we run through in our FAQs, and we'll circulate the link, and it's 2A if you want more detail on that.
Okay, thanks, Tim. That's good. Good to hear. I hope that answers a couple of questions there along that theme. Alice, I think this might be one for you if you don't mind, but on the subject of immigration, if someone loses their job, does this then remove their right to remain? That's a question from a member that's come in today.
So if they come to the UK through the new immigration system and lose their job, hopefully they would have applied for indefinite leave to remain anyway to secure the right to remain in the UK whilst finding alternative employment. That's again published on the Home Office website within the bill as well. On another note, if you are recruiting someone from the EU and they wish to bring family members with, they will automatically have to be in the process of applying for indefinite leave to remain before they even come to the UK in order to bring a family dependent with. That's also a new rule. Bear in mind, this is for tier 2. So that's a tier 2 route. I don't have enough details on tier 1 yet, which is the exceptionally talent route. That's also a capped route and is very different. But as soon as we have more information, I will endeavour to update our members on that.
Excellent. Thanks, Alex. I appreciate that. Tim, Tim or Alice, perhaps I'll leave it up to you to decide. But this is an interesting question here. So you talked, Tim, about travel restrictions for those arriving into England. What does that mean if someone arrives in Scotland and then travels into England? Is that a way of avoiding the restrictions?
Yeah, saw that one coming. Scotland is its own restriction, Roger. So everything I explained only applies to England. Okay. The answer is that the Scottish Government will determine what they're doing for arrivals in Scotland. It begs another question, the obvious question, which is there's nothing to stop people arriving in Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland under a different jurisdiction, having a different set of restrictions, and then, of course, travelling onwards into England. And then the restrictions, the regulations that I refer to don't bite because they only bite on arrivals in England. So there is, yes, I'm going to choose my words carefully here, Roger.
Please do.
Exactly. So this is not UK advice. This is just an observation on the current architecture we have between the devolved nations. If you were an employer, and if you sent the worker out to the UK and they arrived back in England, they'd be subject to the regulations. If you were an employer and the same worker arrived back in another home nation, then they would be subject to different regulations. So I think employers just need to think carefully about where their employees are travelling from in the UK, but also where they arrive back in the UK after they have completed their assignment overseas. I mean, the object of the exercise is to make sure that people don't bring COVID-19 back to the UK. I'm not sure if we've had a question on it, Roger, but I'm going to digress in case we haven't, because it's a useful point to make it. But what I've covered so far are the travel restrictions. What we've not covered, we've covered you can bring someone back into the UK and not quarantine for 14 days, and we've covered that with the exemptions. What we've not covered is whether an employer would be sensible to rely on the exception, or whether the employer should conduct a rather detailed risk assessment on that person coming back into the UK, and whether, having conducted that risk assessment, even if they fitted within an exception, whether the employer would then say, actually, I'm not going to rely on the exception. I think because of what the risk assessment has revealed, I am going to require this particular worker to self-isolate, to quarantine for 14 days, because the risk assessment indicates that there is a prospect that the person would have brought COVID-19 back to the UK, and I don't want that person working on my site. So we've covered part of it today, Roger. What we've not covered, and we've helpfully had the links at the end of the presentation to more information you can get from Make UK, is what should your risk assessment look like if you're bringing someone back into the UK from not just the European Union, Europe, but from worldwide, and they've been to an area where there is a high infection rate of COVID-19, or potentially even they've been to a place, a different country, and their restrictions, the way they dealt with COVID-19 is different to the UK's, for example. So in the UK, we're all familiar with the 2 metre distancing rule. That does not apply in all countries. Other countries have different ways of operating their COVID-19 restrictions. So a bit of a digression there, Roger, but please do think about if someone's coming to the UK for quarantine, all right, I've got an exemption. Should I be relying on the exemption? What does my risk assessment tell me? Does the risk assessment tell me that actually it's safe to rely on the exemption? Or does the risk assessment tell me that actually I should be requiring this worker to self-isolate?
Thanks, Tim. A good digression, because there were a couple of questions on risk assessments actually as well. So thank you very much for that. I've just posted a note to the FAQs link to the FAQs in the chat box, which you can see, which Tim just mentioned there. Where look, I know we're up to our allotted time for today. There's probably fair to say, Tim and Alice, there's a handful of questions which we didn't get round to. There's not many, but just a handful. So I'll look to see if we can get a response to those questions, so we don't leave any unanswered questions after the session. So that just reminds me, leads me to say thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. Thanks Tim and Alice for your time today. Thanks for reminding me to say that both Tim and Alice's contact details are on the screen right now as well. A very useful reminder. So if you do want to get in touch, please do feel free to make use of those contact details there. Other than that, I'll wish everyone a good afternoon. Thanks very much, everyone. Thank you.